always so nice to be here and so nice to see all of you. There are a lot of familiar faces, and those of you who know me will not be surprised by how warm I feel right now, that I'm actually doing something semi-normal, to me anyway.
People in the room.
It looks a little weird, it's different, the masks, the spacing and so forth, but we were talking when we were back there about how great it is to be doing something that is natural to us, and something that we haven't done in a very long time. Seeing all of you is a huge part of that for me. Also being in this gallery and looking at art is just fantastic, and I want to thank Nicholas Metivier. I want to thank his wonderful team for everything that they've done, not least this event and this beautiful exhibition. It is really great to come into this beautiful space and see these pictures one at a time, particularly for me because I've been talking to Ed about this project now for several months, but I've only seen them digitally. I've only seen them on my little laptop screen, and it is quite transformational to see them in person. I do want to elaborate just a little bit before we start about my history with Ed, because I've now spent quite a few years, since 2008 we were realizing earlier, so that's what now, 12 years, engaging with Ed and his work, and it has meant a lot for me, not only my career, but also for my whole way of thinking about photography. And I've changed how I think about the medium because of the hundreds, thousands of conversations that I've had with Ed about all kinds of things. His work, to be sure, but also many other subjects. Because the way that Ed thinks about photography and how it operates in the world and how people view and experience and learn about the world through photography has been really fantastic for me. So for me, it's great to be able to engage with this body of work tonight in front of all of you. While I know his work well, obviously, I have to say that this body of work, Natural Order, is something entirely new for me in Ed's work. It relates to a strain of his work that he did early in his career, and he'll talk to you more about that tonight, because Ed did start as a landscape photographer during his days at Ryerson University. But this is really something beyond that. This is landscape work that I don't think he could have made at that moment in his career, and that looks the way it does now because of everything else that he has done in his career, pictures that don't look much like these. The vision that you see here is a vision that he has evolved over time. And that's been really interesting for me today in particular, as I saw the pictures at this scale for the first time. And I'm still wrestling with it. So you're getting a very fresh response from me because I'm trying to figure out how these pictures are operating. And honestly, tonight, that's what my questions will be aimed at, trying to understand the aesthetics of Ed's body of work, how they operate, why he made them the way that he did, and why it is that they're different from, I think, what first glance might lead you to believe. Why it is that they are not straightforward scenes from nature, as you might imagine. One of the important things I think that we should all recognize, and I'm opinionated to be sure, and I'm biased absolutely, but I do want to say it because I think it's easy here in Ed's, the city. I mean, I can't call it your hometown. You're from St. Catharines originally.
Close enough.
But close enough. I think that we forget this here in Toronto, just how important he is in this genre of landscape art. Ed is, without a question, the most definitive, most influential landscape photographer of the last century. I don't think that's even remotely an exaggeration. It's becoming clearer day by day as we all go online and we see drone photographs by innumerable people, as we start to understand the view from above the landscape as being a natural viewpoint, when in fact, when Ed began doing it, it was incredibly difficult to do and not at all a normal perspective or way of looking at the land. So he is really one of the key figures in transforming the genre of landscape to wrestle with man's relationship to land, maybe the key figure in that transformation. There's a whole vocabulary that we have visually that we did not have before his multi-decade career. And so this in some ways is a quite astonishing body of work because it seems at first glance to be a bit outside of that tradition, and yet it is not. One of the reasons for Ed's continuing importance, I think, is on view here, and it is one of the things that ties this body of work to earlier bodies of work, and that is the sheer amount of focus that Ed brings to bear in making an experience for his audience. He is, more than most photographers I've ever met, very conscious of how his work will affect physically, visually, and intellectually and emotionally the people that stand in front of his pictures. He thinks about that experience more than anyone I know. And when I said earlier that he had affected how I think about photography and its power, it's mostly that I'm referring to. Because the way that Ed thinks about everything from the surface of the images to the way that they're framed, to whether there's glazing in front of them, to how they're lit, to their physical scale, to how the person who stands in front of them is either pulled inward or pushed back by their scale, is something that's really quite electrifying to discuss with him. And that quality is apparent in this work, as well as in his large-scale industrial photographs. So, on that note, I'm going to jump into my first question because I want him to tell us tonight how he does it. And I'm sure that's really simple, right? We'll be able to work this out in 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, we'll try.
Exactly. So my first question is about the way that you innovate with your image making. And by that I mean, most artists, when they work with a set of tools, they're very accustomed to those tools. They are often quite traditional tools, and they're making images that we have an existing context for as viewers. In Ed's case, Ed is always pushing against the limits of his tools and seeking new tools that will allow him to do something that will physically and emotionally challenge his viewers. And I'm very interested in that, whether it's the cameras that he's used, the software that he uses, the drones, that eventually were the evolution of how he tried, as he once said to me, to find a place to stand where you can't possibly stand in order to make an image. The printing technologies that he's evolved over time. All of these things allow him to push forward to say something that otherwise would be very difficult to say. And this series of work is no different. And so I'm wondering, Ed, if you can talk about that tonight, if you can show us how it is in this body of work you've done something new, even if it's imperceptible to the audience, and even if you normally wouldn't tell them what all the strings are, all the stuff behind the curtain.
Well, thank you for your kind words, Paul. Yeah, I think part of I've always seen photography as an art form, but there's a healthy amount of science and chemistry in it as well. So I grew out of the conventional printing of pictures, black and white, which was very kind of oriented towards customization. You can customize your developers and your papers and your films, and all three of those things come together and create a feeling and a look. So I've always been pushed by, even at Ryerson, by my teachers to really understand that end product is as strong as the weakest link. And so I've always been very interested in optics and very interested in the chemical and the papers and the responses to reality. So it's always this, here's reality, how do I take that and translate it onto a print? And I kind of sprung out into the world in the early 80s, graduating from Ryerson, and I was trying to make a career as a commercial photographer doing architectural work, and it was just, if any of you were there in the early 80s, it was a pretty rough recession. All the architects were barely keeping their doors open. I had to find something else. I started applying for grants, and I was quite successful. But I also, as a side business, started printing color prints for other artists, and then decided to open up Toronto Imageworks in 1985 as a way to, because back in 85 there wasn't a market, there wasn't a real viable way to make a living as an artist. When I even looked in the States and the photographers I studied, they were all teaching or doing something else and their art. There wasn't like a standalone, photographer, even the famous ones. So I looked at that and I thought, well, there's no chance I'm going to do it. I have to find something else. So the printing process became really important, and opening up a lab taught me about business. It also taught me about how to maintain quality on a consistent level, and to really, and because I opened the lab and it became fairly central to the city, then all of a sudden Kodak and Agfa and Ilford and Fuji and all the optical companies and everything were bringing me things to try. And I was always at that cusp of saying, oh, this is better than that, this is better. And I never moved until that was better than that. So even though in 1992 I opened up a digital printing lab in Toronto, one of the first, I didn't actually take my first digital image until 2006. Because, that's like 14 years later, because it wasn't better than shooting 4x5 or 8x10 and then drum scanning that and making a print from that. So I only moved when the technology gave me something that was better than what I was using before. So when it came to this, I had been using Hasselblad as my digital go-to, and ending up at the 100 megapixel Hasselblad, and I was doing all my aerial work with that, which was pretty incredible. But sometimes I'd have to, when I'm doing aerial work and it's late light and it's beautiful and I have to open wide open, and I can only get so low in a shutter speed because I'm bouncing around in a helicopter with the door open, but yet I wanted to feel like I had the camera on a tripod and it looks perfectly still, so I'm gyro stabilizing and everything, and I would take a picture, and then at wide open sometimes, when in that low light, I'd look at it and it was soft. And then I realized that the 100 megapixel back had exceeded the quality that the lens could deliver. So I started investigating that, and then found that the Phase camera, which is the one I did this with, worked with Schneider to create optics that were engineered to be able to perform at the level of 100. So instead of the 100 megapixel, it's 150 megapixel back. So all of a sudden you have and it's all about optics. I mean, the back is important, and what your sensor is important, but really the quality and the feel of the images is always optics. And so when that was married up and I looked at it, I finally said, okay, I'm moving from one system, which was a big move, to a whole new system of working. And I've only had that camera for less than a year. And when the whole lockdown happened, that was early March, I said to Julia, I got to go back into the studio. I need to get my camera. I want to learn more about all the depth of the menus, and I want to get more comfortable with it, so I want to start shooting. So the first thing I did with it is was practicing in the house, and it did something very unusual, which I could never do before, which is called focus stacking. So I can choose the foreground focus, and I can choose the background focus.
You mean the distance?
The distance, and I'd focus for the background, and I'd focus for the foreground, and I can choose anywhere from 3 minimum to 40 images that would incrementally, automatically shoot all the way down.
So you push the shutter once and it would make...
Correct. And the focus would change, click, change, click, change, click. So I have to only work in very calm days. And then you take all those, and I was usually using 10, and I would take all 10 of those images and put them in software, and then the software would find the sharpest from the foreground to the background and blend it to keep that sharpness as deep or shallow as I want. So now I have full control of how deep. And what I was interested in, there was an image so the first image I took was the image of the snow, so that was in mid-March. So that's just on my property, and I went out there and took that picture.
Where is this, by the way? Where are you when you're making this picture? You say your property.
It's my property, so the house is just above to the right. Actually, that was, I had a little jump that I had built for the kids that had broken, and then it was like a relic from tobogganing. And so it's underneath that pile, and then all the weeds all the bramble had grown over it and created, that. And then the snow fell that morning, and then I went and shot. But this is an image I was just saying, that was done in 1981, and I kind of made that image, and I said, this is really speaking directly back. And this is an image from 1981 that I still felt really affinity for. It still had some, it sort of telescoped through 40 years and still had something that held my interest and attention. And when I took that picture, I realized that, I said, that's very much reminiscent of that image. And all of a sudden, but I used focus stacking. So this is one of the first images I did where if you could do it in one shot, there's no way you can close down to do that in one shot. So that's a combination of about 4 or 5 frames all stitched together in software. So I became really interested in this whole new way of being able to make something that was previously impossible, because you can't get that in one single shot. So most of these are done that way. So most of these are using that, incredible ability to get that depth. And even when I was back there in the early 80s, so when you go into these kinds of landscapes, they're very chaotic. It's you're looking at almost infinite detail all the time. And so what I learned in that, I always say it was like me learning my scales if I was a musician. It's like being able to go into complexity and chaos and find the order. And it's attenuating your eye, and you have to be in the present all the time, just looking deeply at it until all of a sudden it just arrives. And it could be, it's not there, but 12 inches away, all of a sudden it all makes sense. And it's that kind of nuance of finding those moments, which was kind of interesting, and it got me back into this idea of this infinite depth, and the idea that if you look, most of them have a centrality to them and yet an all-overness to them. So there's these two things at work. And to me, it was almost like looking at, like a Pollock abstract expressionism in field painting, or even a Riopelle. It's all evenly distributed across a plane, and it all kind of makes sense, but there is a kind of a movement that happens throughout it. And so I was curious, because at this time of year, this presents itself, and as soon as the leaves come in, that's over. It's only in that structure that I found that happens in that 2-month period, which I happened to be there during the lockdown. I was supposed to, in April, be in Africa shooting from a helicopter. And clearly I wasn't there. So here I was with the camera, and
your feet on the ground.
Feet on the ground, and it was really refreshing. It was, as I said, when I'm doing those other shoots, it was like 95% perspiration and 5% inspiration when you get that 1 hour in the helicopter, or the 1 day in the mine in Norilsk or whatever. Here, I just go out, me, camera, subject, all the time I want. And it was so refreshing to just go back to basics. It was really quite a kind of a nice release from the way I normally worked.
Yeah, which is interesting. I mean, on the one hand, the practice is very similar to a practice that that was much more common to your work far earlier in your career. But then on the other hand, this technology had really altered what it was you could get out of this condensed, complicated tangle of foliage and trees and leaves that are shifting by the minute. And that's something that I find very interesting about these pictures. This abstract overall quality that you mentioned is really unlike anything that I've seen in nature photography before, because of the level of complexity, which is just completely off the charts. And because of this weird space, this collapsed space of intensely sharp, detailed foliage, which, Ed refers to the fact that it is sort of infinite depth. But at the same time, if you get up really close to any of these pictures and you look carefully at them, there's also a weird flattening quality within that depth. And it's a bit unnerving. It's quite complicated. It's not, just like looking at a picture and thinking, oh, what a nice pattern, which I think is when we think of a photograph of the real world and we say to ourselves, it's abstract. We don't really mean fully abstract. What we mean is it's a beautiful pattern. And these certainly are that, but they are also so much more than that. And I find it really interesting because it's a bit intense. When you get up to these pictures, when you stand back far from them, you're trying to create order. You're looking for a horizon line. You're looking for the ground that you stand on, the mid-distance that gives you a sense of your own relationship to the scale of what you see. And that's really tricky in these pictures. And so I wanted to ask you whether this was something that simply evolved as you used this technology and figured out how to make it work, Was it conscious to make them this interesting kind of abstract complexity? And also, how do you see the relationship between this type of abstraction and the types of abstraction that you've made before, usually from high above the earth, in your other bodies of work, like water? I think of water, all the mini-series that you did around water. There were incredibly beautiful abstractions in that project. How do these relate to those?
Well, in almost all of my work, once in a while I do it, but very rarely do I stand on terra firma, with my camera at my height and shoot with the ground breaking away from the lens in a normal way. And in almost all of my work, the world begins out there somewhere, and then it goes off. So that I've often been far more interested in that kind of the mid-level of landscapes versus the whole deep perspective of a landscape. I like the flattening effect. So going in the air was for sure the ability to abstract. And the thing that I've always been interested in is, can I make the world feel like an abstract, but it's reality. It's, and by also finding, like for instance in my earlier work, finding the largest mines in the world, or the large, and then getting into a helicopter and photographing it. So this is a place you'd never normally find yourself, and that you can kind of get up and see the world in a way that it's hard to imagine, like who would make that world and why that world exists and where do those colors come from, because you're unearthing the ground and all of that. So the helicopter, and I started shooting, my first helicopter shot was 2003 when I did the freeway in Los Angeles. And then I did a couple more rentals of helicopter in 2006 when I did AMARC, which was the Tucson, Arizona airfield that was abandoned aircraft and all the military aircraft. And that was the second time I rented a helicopter. And then it started becoming part of my repertoire of, okay, when I want to get up and show a vast area and compress it. And so there's a compression that happens as soon as you get up, and the midground opens up. Kind of like a Bruegel painting. That's all full of midground, and you can see all the stories play themselves out. This is also similar, where the foreground really doesn't start. It's just all there. It's all planar. It's all on like a plane. And that to me was always like, so when I shot 4x5, I kept thinking, because when I was a kid I painted, and when I got my first camera I said, hell, this is a lot easier than painting. I really like painting, but I can do it in one shot. In a fraction of a second, I get the whole image. And I just, at 11, felt this is the way to go.
Right.
And so it's always been that kind of interest in creating what would be like a painting, but in one instant. And so that's always been a driver of mine. And so when I started shooting 4x5 or 8x10, I would think of what I'm shooting the way a painter was, how do I fill the canvas? How do I make something that is enduring, something that is interesting? So the Railcut series, I would say it was the first really, 1983, 82, that was something that still carries on today. And I think those images still hold up today. But it was trying to find something that was a way to, again, flatten the field and refer to a lot of things that I understood in painting, but trying to find the equivalents in photography. And then abstract expressionism was another one of that, again, flattening of the field. So in many ways, this was a kind of a complete return, but again, with these tools that I can only dream of. Like when I look at these images, I mean, I ended in my film world shooting 8x10 negs. And an 8x10 neg is like, if you think of a contact sheet with a whole row of 36 on a contact sheet, that's an 8x10 neg. I'm doing that in one shot with a big lens. And so that's a lot of detail. That's a lot of, and it's almost grainless. But these are, as a 2 1/4 chip, are now rivaling what I was able to do with an 8x10, but now I'm doing it with digital. So it is this kind of evolution and moving with the tools, but also kind of keeping, with a train of thought, and also with the one of the ideas where it felt right to be doing this is that I began with a love of nature, and I think the 40 years of work that I've done is really of our industrial and urban usurping of nature, and that nature is being pushed back at our success. and now, nature's in a way pushing it back. We now have a virus that's pinning down the global world of humans around the world, that somehow nature's now, it's reversed it on ourselves. So to me, it felt right to stare into the eye of nature again, and thinking that when I looked at these, I really felt that they represent kind of our own bodies. Like if you look at our nervous system, and if you look at our vascular system, or if you look at our neural nets in our brains, that same trend, that same way of moving water and nutrients, from the soils into the branches, into the leaves, it's the same way we, live. And so there's this kind of equivalence that I started to see in the complexity of these things, and the complexity, as we now have learned, of how our brains are constructed, and all the synapses and neural nets. So it really felt like there was a kind of looking at our own, internal body mechanisms, but somehow externalized. And in many ways, I kept thinking that natural order might have been enduring order, because if somehow we don't make it as a species and extinct ourselves, I think this order will still be there. It will still persist. And this was here way before we arrived on the scene. So this is this kind of geological kind of pattern that I felt I was trying to tap into and understand.
It occurs to me, listening to you now, that if there is something in common between this type of abstraction and the type of abstraction that we've seen in your aerial views, it may be that by eliminating the obvious ground that we would normally see at the bottom of a picture going into a scene, we then lose our own place in it, and we're forced to look at something and to figure out what our place is in it. It forces us to wrestle with where we're standing.
We're hovering.
Yeah, we're hovering. So these, in a way, you could talk about them almost as though they're aerial, even though they're not aerial pictures, even though they really were made from the ground. And while there are indicators that make you think, oh, I'm standing right here and I'm looking at this scene, and we project ourselves into the place, especially at this scale, at the same time, there's something that's not quite right. And that seems, in my mind, to dovetail very well with the idea that while you're trying to figure out where you stand, you then start questioning what you're seeing. And so the analogy between a scene of nature typical at a particular moment in time can also be interpreted as other things. And as an abstraction, you can see it. We've talked about this as something like the veins of a body, or the neural net in a mind. And that's really quite compelling. It makes you wonder what it is you're seeing, which I think is really quite magical. There's another thing going on here which you maybe aren't seeing because you're looking at one picture at a time. But if you look at Ed's book, you will see this, and that is that there's a bit of a story being told as well. There's a bit of a narrative, which is really just in the subtlest of ways. It's about the passage of time. It's about when he started making the pictures and when he stopped. And I did want to talk about that, the seasonal shift that you happen to be present for, the emergence of the woods from a kind of a winter slumber into the flowering of spring. And I wanted to know how you thought about that. When did you realize that that's what was happening? When did you start thinking, well, I can shape these into a book and make a kind of a sequence of them? And also, how did you think of showing spring emerging? Like, how did you want that to come forward in the pictures?
Well, I'm always kind of interested, in subtle tonalities. I call it, I like the spring or the late fall when most of the trees down. I call it the quarter colors of the season. Whereas once all the leaves break forward and it becomes all green, I stop seeing. It just becomes a wall, and there's no way I can't look at the structure anymore. It just becomes a wall of green, and the complexity, kind of disappears. It becomes, but when I first started shooting, like the snow image, it was this kind of beautiful snow that just lands through the night with no winds, and it just sits there. But I think 2 hours later, a wind came in, and it was all gone. It was just like boom. It was just this transient little moment and so I just started at that point, and it was just, I kept hoping to have as much time without the leaves coming as possible. And it was a delayed spring. It just, every time it looked like they were about to pop, you know, it would be a freeze that would come along and push it back. So I had about, you know, 3 false starts of a spring. So it was a very, and then when it did come in, it just rushed in like within 3 days, it was all green. And there were, I did shoot some of the green in that, especially that lime green where it first pops. But it's just, again, it's a palette. It's about palette. There's a certain type of colors that I like to work with, by and large. And so the last picture I took is the one with the grasses coming through the trees in the back wall over there. And that was kind of as far as I could go with the green. That seemed to be like my threshold of where I found, you know, the tones were still the way I want to see them. The complexity was still there, but there's this kind of indication of hope and life reborn, you know, right there as a little line in the image. And to me, that was really that's when I figured it was kind of like a period to that kind of series. And I think by the end of March, when I called Nick and I sent him a couple of JPEGs and said, you know, this is where I'm going. And he got excited about it. And he said, these are really interesting. And, you know, why don't we do that give back, that you know, why don't we do a portfolio? Right. So originally it was just going to be a portfolio. I didn't expect an exhibition. I wasn't thinking of it, but I did say, I think these are going to really look interesting large because I've got this new camera. I haven't seen this subject big. I haven't really played it out yet, but I think there's something, that's something here in the prints that might be good. And then we did some test prints when in between, and indeed, you know, we found them interesting to be in the presence of the large prints. And that's something, going back to what you said, I had an art teacher back in Niagara College who once said, if you want to understand where the zeitgeist is and you understand what people are reacting to or what archetypes are, go into a gallery and just sit and watch the painting where people stop the most. Just observe for where do they stop, and then go and look at that and try to understand, because you know what it is that makes that image more interesting than the one beside it. And to me, like you know, in first year I studied Freud and Jung, but Jung was far more interesting in that, you know, the whole idea of collective consciousness and the archetype, and that we all kind of can experience something in a universal, consistent way. And so for me, it was that universal language that's why landscapes were interesting, because you can understand them, and there's no translation necessary whether I show them here or whether I show them in China or whether I show them in Indonesia. You know, people will connect. It's a language that doesn't need translation. And so for me, that was really interesting to keep, you know, that one of the powers of the visual language is that it doesn't need translation when you tap into something that is almost like, these are almost like looking into a campfire almost, where you just get drawn into the kind of complexity of what nature is and the kind of mysteries and surprises that can give one. So, you know, for me, it was that encounter session, going with my camera and saying, where is it? How do I find it? And it is like, for the first time in a long time too, where I could just really be in the present. Like, I have to be in the present. I can't think of anything else. I can't, you know, I'm there with the subject, and if I don't stay dialed in, I lose it. It's kind of, so it was really refreshing, because we live in such a world of disruption, you know, whether it's our phones or text or, you know, meetings or whatever else we all do, you know. So it was nice to go back to a very simpler and immersive kind of moment.
Before I get to my last question, I want to highlight something that Ed just mentioned. He talked about he briefly mentioned that there's a portfolio of these photographs, and it was mentioned in the introduction as well. When you work with Ed for a while, you find out that that for Ed, making landscapes, whichever landscapes he's working on, is always a social act in all kinds of ways, and that there's always a social politics to it, and it's always about the world. A lot of people don't think that way about the genre of landscape. They think of landscape as a way of escaping society, a way of escaping politics. And as I think you all know, he doesn't do that. His work, particularly the work about industrial tension, the tension between industrial operations and the nature that it impacts and the people whose lives it changes, is of course a through line of all of his work. So I found it interesting that while making these pictures, and before I even understood exactly what social imperative Ed was thinking about, like how does this relate to the pandemic, for example, he told me it did. but how? Is it just that he's isolated and out there and trying to make pictures? As soon as I was, starting to grapple with it, Ed was saying to me, completely in concert with the making of these pictures, that he wanted to make a benefit to help the Canadian art scene continue. And I started to see a linkage between this idea of the hopefulness of spring coming forward and the idea of using the revenue that he was going to make from this portfolio. And he and Nick right away were on the same page about this, that they would then commit that to supporting young artists who are working. I saw a different kind of spring in that gesture. And obviously I'm very grateful that you guys are doing that and doing it for my institution as well as the AGO. It's very meaningful, but it's also really consistently the case that Ed thinks this way. So that's not a question, that's just an editorial statement, but I did want to say it because I think it helps understand the work, that for Ed there is that statement of hope in the middle of this pandemic was something that he really wanted to assert going out of this body of work. My last question, though, is about the lasting impact of these pictures. I think that, to me, it's quite self-evident that the bodies of work that you've done about that friction between what it is that we need to live the lives that we lead and the impact of those industrial operations on nature becomes more relevant with every passing day. I mean, he's really the definitive artist on the subject of climate change for me. It is less evident to me walking into this room how this work will last. And yet I have an evolving feeling, which is that these pictures, for anybody that spends sustained time with them, that they will be able to be fascinated by these pictures endlessly going forward. And I wanted to try to figure out how that was, and I'm curious why you think it is. My sense is that this hyper-reality of the pictures and the tension between realism and abstraction that comes from the hyper-reality, from the almost jarring level of detail that we're seeing, is a big part of it, that there's a constant revelation of detail when you stand in front of these pictures. And I can imagine that anybody that has one of these in their home, anybody that sees one of them, if one of them ever gets hung in a lobby and you're sitting there waiting for your doctor's appointment and you see one, that you would just stare at them. You would just not stop staring at them because it is so hard to get a fix on them, and you keep looking for a way in and you keep going to them, and yet they do not push you away. And they're obviously not forgettable in the way that a lot of overall landscape scenes, you can look right past them and through them and move on. They're obviously not that. So there's something extraordinarily compelling about these. And it's not a simple question that I have to ask you, but how do you do that? How is it that you make a picture and then when you're editing it, think to yourself, this is going to last. This is not a simple image of a place. This is something more than that.
Well, it is an interesting question. I don't always get it right, but I get an intuition that there's something in it that it's interesting when I first started making these images back in the late 70s and early 80s when I first began, and that in the chaos that you're walking through, and I would take a lot of pictures and come back and go, no, didn't work. No, didn't work. And that was back when I was committing, like dollars I didn't have to film and processing and all of that. And so it was like it was a learning experience. And it's like anything, even scientific inquiry or when you're inventing something, it's all the failures you kind of accumulate. And learn from. Like Edison said, the 10,000 failures I've had are just all the things I knew what not to do again, and now, but I figured out where, how to make it work. So that iterating, I think, is an important creative process until you get to that thing that all of a sudden has ability. And for me, it's that when you stand in front of an image, the first thing it is that it sort of makes sense as an image, that there's somehow, this should have always been a picture, or why wasn't this a picture before? You know, and to steer away from cliche, because as soon as you go into landscape, as you said, you can see right through. Well, that's cliches because they're so embedded in our head that when we look at it, we go, oh yeah, I know that picture. I know that. You know, that's a classic, whatever. And you've seen it 1,000 times, and you just dismiss it because it no longer, you know, speaks to us. So clearly, I want to stay away from, you know, creating, you know, a cliche, and that the only way I felt you can get there is through your own iteration. So when you find something and you go, oh, okay, that's working. Okay, why is it working? And then you put that up there and you look at it and you ponder it and you say, okay, I'm going to try and best that. You know, I want to take that somewhere else and improve that. Where do I go to improve that? How do I do that? What can I do? Like a lot of these, what I found, which I couldn't do before, which was really interesting, is that I could start using a telephoto lens. So all of a sudden, you know, I can be further away and zoom in on something with a longer lens and then focus stack it. You see, there's no way you could have done that without focus stacking as well. So like that's a telephoto lens, the one there, but that you see. And you know, if you know, there would be no, it's an absolute impossibility to do that with film in my 8x10. It just wouldn't be possible. So again, it's just the tool allowed me to say, aha, that's really interesting. Way over there, that little section, I'll get a long lens and I'll carve it out, and that's of that space. So it is that you know, iterating that I think, and learning from the iterating that you kind of get to these places. The other thing I wanted to also mention about how this subject felt right for the pandemic, in that. And all the other work I did. And if you see in the water book, I started bringing in natural landscapes, and even more in the Anthropocene book when I brought the images from Vancouver Island and the you know, the rainforest images, and so I've been kind of going back. And the idea here is that, you know, we are in a pandemic, which is a crisis of all kinds of levels, from a health crisis to an economic crisis to you know, getting back to an educational crisis that we're now seeing. So all these things are but what I kept thinking is this is a transient problem. We're going to figure it out. We're going to get a vaccine. We're going to find some medicinal out on this one, and probably within the next 6 months to a year, I would expect. Whereas the one crisis that there is no vaccine for is climate crisis. And once we tip over that, then there isn't like a vaccine for it. There isn't something we don't have a toolkit to fix that one. So I thought during this time, during this crisis, isn't it interesting to look at the next one, and that we've mobilized efficiently as a society to deal with this one, and we can see how governments and people can comply and try and fix the problem. And so in a lot of ways, I felt we need to look at nature. It's that biodiversity and the nature that we're pushing back is our greatest threat. And once we reduce that biodiversity to the point where it can't sustain life, it's not like we know how to reboot it. We don't, you know, and there is no easy fix once we break it, or once the methane starts going off in the north, when the permafrost starts melting, and then, you know, that methane has 32 times the warming effect of CO2. So then we're really, you know, adding to something that there isn't, like, there's nothing we can do. That's Siberia and northern Canada. It's like there is nothing in our toolkit to stop that methane from you know, going up. So to me, it's you know, bringing my own thoughts back to nature and its complexity and its importance. I don't think there is a time where we're on this threshold that if we don't get it right, we may never be able to recover. And so I feel that this is an important time to, you know, stare into the eye of what is nature and why is it important.
That's a perfect endpoint. All right, thank you, all of you, for being here. Thank you, Nicholas Metivier, and thank you, Ed.
Thank you.